Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Let's Talk Tuesday. This day's topic is LGBTQ plus awareness. I'm Alex Gallegos, the student member to the State Board of Education, and I also go to El Dorado High School.
My name is Paige Lawrie. I'm the 4A2 Vice President, and I go to Northwestern Technical Academy.
Hey everybody, I'm Alex Bybee. I'm an NASC alum. I served on the executive board in the 2011-2012 school year, and I'm looking forward to joining today for a conversation about LGBTQ issues.
All right, so to introduce our topic, we just wanted to go over the acronym. So LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And then there are also many variations of the acronym. So there's LGBTQA+, A standing for asexual, and sometimes Q can be interpreted as queer. There are other, just to be all inclusive, there's also sometimes I added. So just be mindful that we are trying to be as inclusive as possible and that there are other ways that people refer to it. So although we have a lot of work to do, Nevada is also commonly known as one of the most gay-friendly states. 5.5% of Nevada's population identifies as LGBTQ+, and there are roughly 127,000 people that identify. And a 2011 study by UCLA said that 3.5% of US adults identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and then just 3% are transgender.
So the first question, I think, is more of a general overall, but what is your experience with the LGBTQ community, and what does pride mean to you personally?
Great. Well, I went through my high school experience in student council, and during my high school years, I was not out. So it wasn't until my sophomore year of college that I chose to publicly identify as a gay man. And so that's my direct experience with being a member of the community. And I have friends that identify with just about every other letter in the expansive acronym, as you refer to the diversity of our community. And pride really means to me fully embracing and celebrating who we are, who we were born as, and who we are meant to be. You know, a lot of the conversation in my time in high school was focused on tolerance as opposed to full acceptance and embracing. For me, pride is the distinction between simply tolerating somebody for who they are and fully embracing and celebrating them for that being a critical part of their identity.
Yeah, so me and Paige, we talked about this earlier. We said that even though you might not identify with the community, you can still have like some kind of extension towards it. So like we talked about, some of our family members might be identifiers, and it's always important to put out your support for them and back the movement, even though you yourself are not part of it.
Right.
Honestly, during Pride celebrations, I think one of the coolest things for me is seeing people that don't identify with that community.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of the times where A meaning asexual, but some people interpret it as ally. And I think that kind of including yourself in a way that you're not taking away from the community, but you're like, hey, this is a really cool thing, and it's cool that we're celebrating it. I don't know, it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it is powerful. I think allyship is so important in this movement. When you consider some of the statistics that you referenced, Alec, about the percentage of Nevadans that identify as LGBTQ, or even nationally who identify, there are ranging estimates on that because some people are open and some people aren't, depending on the climate of where they live and whether it would be safe for them to be out publicly. But when you think about 7% of a population generally, and you think about the power of allyship to expand the number of people who are standing in support with the community, mathematically that makes a really big difference. And so I agree with you, Paige. Allyship is one of the beautiful parts of Pride celebrations, is seeing people come out and support, celebrate, and empower the community.
All right, our next question is, why is this topic important for student leaders to discuss?
So I know that, at least for my school environment, we have a relatively open and welcoming environment towards that community. But while it is something that I think is cool to see, there's definitely a lot more that can be done, because for us, we see it's different for a lot of different schools. Nevada, we're a little bit more lucky than other places, but you see how members of the LGBTQ community are seen as their group. it's like a social standing where people see, oh, well, that's the gay kid, or that's someone who is part of that group, and it's kind of like distancing yourself. You're like, oh, I'm okay with them, but there's, I think, a big difference between tolerance and inclusion. And that's something that not a lot of kids are aware of, that there's a difference between those two.
Yeah, so I think you bring up a really good point, Paige, around awareness. That's a word that you just used. And I think that the role of student leadership is bringing awareness and having those conversations and hearing from the perspectives and the voices of your LGBTQ peers in school. You know, the idea that perhaps in a school community, LGBTQ students are seen as their own social group as opposed to being integrated or included or embraced more broadly in the school community. I think that really brings up an important point around recognizing that if someone identifies as LGBTQ, that is not their whole identity, it is a part of their identity. And sometimes when we reduce someone to a label, it makes them feel confined to living up to the expectations that people have around what that part of their identity means. And I think that can be really challenging, particularly for students to navigate, because in high school, you're really coming to understand who you are and what your values are and how you fit in the world. And while you're grappling with all that, you're also having to bump up against the expectations of, well, if I identify as gay or lesbian or transgender, these are the sets of behaviors or experiences or attitudes that I'm supposed to reflect based on cultural expectations. So I think that student leaders can help break down some of those barriers and provide an environment where students feel like they can be all of who they are, and where their sexuality or gender identity doesn't define them, but is a part of their identity that's embraced and celebrated.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's important to push those boundaries, especially when you're trying to break those norms. I think is specifically important. Like, why do we consider one thing to be normal and then another thing to be like taboo, you know?
Yeah, and who gets to decide?
So for the next question is, what can schools do to support, or what more can schools do to support our LGBTQ communities?
When I reflect on my time as a student in the K-12 public education system, one thing that I didn't realize had as significant of an impact as it did at the time, as I've realized in retrospect that it perhaps did, is the lack of representation and inclusivity of LGBTQ stories in the curriculum, and in particular, the story of our nation's history and how we came to be who we are today. I didn't learn anything about the Stonewall movement in New York that happened 50 years ago that gave birth to the LGBTQ rights movement. And so when you don't see yourself acknowledged or reflected in the curricula, nor do you see yourself reflected in the adults in the building, there's oftentimes a stigma around adults that are LGBTQ being out at work. And so when you don't see your identity reflected either in the staff or in the curriculum, it can be a really challenging experience because you don't feel seen or heard. And it can feel scary to speak up about who you are because you don't know whether or not you're going to be rejected or embraced, which is particularly challenging in high school when social acceptance is such a critical part of identity formation.
Yeah, and I think representation just at large is really important. Not just in schools, but also in movies, like some of the movies that we've been seeing, making people more comfortable and realizing that it is a normal thing.
I've been amazed to see the progress that's been made just over the last decade in people's attitudes and beliefs around the LGBTQ community. For so long, our narrative has been defined by other people, and it feels like we're starting to make more progress where we get to define our narrative. I think that's a really important aspect for any historically marginalized community, to be able to define their own narrative and speak for themselves on how they want to be treated and perceived and exist in a space, which includes our public schools.
And when you think about really like how long the movement has been around, I mean, relatively it's frequently new, only probably in the 21st century, 20th century. So yeah, there's always work to be done.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to remember is that even if the movement as we understand it is new in an American context, gender identity and sexual orientation are not new. These are parts of identity that have existed for humanity since we were a species on Earth. And so sometimes I think it's important to situate ourselves in the broader context of this conversation. We can, I think, sometimes tend to have a limited perspective on the arc of the movement to be focused specifically on LGBTQ rights in America. But we also know there's so much progress to make globally and for our public school students in other countries too.
All right, our next question is, how can individuals and communities at large do better for their LGBTQ plus counterparts?
This is something, so I serve on the board of the Human Rights Campaign, which is the nation's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization. And this question is actually one that the organization, I think, has been asking itself over the last couple of years, specifically around how do we do better as a country? How do even LGBTQ rights groups do better? I think when I see a headline that another transgender woman of color has been murdered for being who she is, and living her truth and her identity, it shows me that we have so much progress to make for those in the community who are standing at the intersection of multiple oppressed identities, as a transgender person, as a female, as a person of color. All of those pieces of their identity that, again, are a part of them but do not define their whole person often lead to violence against them. And I think that as a country, there's more progress we can make to have conversations around the violence that transgender members of our community experience. And I think ensuring that they feel safe and welcome in school is the start of the trajectory for the well-being that they may experience for the rest of their lives. I mean, the trauma I know that I still feel and experience from being marginalized or bullied for being gay, when people perhaps noticed that I was a little more effeminate than I was masculine, or noticed that I had more female friends than I had male friends. You know, that goes back to 5th grade and middle school. And while I've done a lot of work to unpack those experiences and feel comfortable in who I am, those traumas and those memories stick with us forever. And I think about the profound lifelong impact that has on more marginalized members of our community. And so creating a place in schools where people feel embraced and welcome can make the difference for lifelong outcomes for a person. And I think we need to focus on those in our community who are most marginalized and frankly being, murdered in this country.
Yeah, and like you said, it's important to kind of dismantle those stereotypes too and stop trying to make movements small or trying to make it comfortable fitting into like a nice, pretty box. So it doesn't mean the same thing for everybody, just like what we see with the Black Lives Matter movement going on right now too. It's important that we dismantle those stereotypes and realize that it is a big movement and that it looks a lot different to a lot of different people.
Yeah, it's expansive, right? A movement can have a set of values and issues that advocate for a particular group. But within that movement are individual perspectives and story. And within movements, there's tensions and disagreement around the strategy and what direction the movement may go. And to your point, it's important that we create space to recognize that you can't package somebody into a neat identity and arrive at a set of conclusions around who they are.
And I think also recognizing the overlap between those movements too, because I think a lot of people feel like they have to be an advocate for Pride or have to be an advocate for Black Lives Matter, or even just any movement that you are personally involved with or you have personal experiences with, and kind of disregarding that you can feel like you are discriminated against at different levels, and that doesn't make any more important or less important. And I think that's neglected a lot because people feel like we've made progress, so we don't need to keep making progress. Especially in our schools, I've seen that happen a lot.
Yeah, so. And I think, Alex, you brought up a good point when you opened this up, which is that Nevada is one of the more LGBTQ friendly states in the country as it comes to our set of laws and district policies that exist to support LGBTQ students. And so it's important to remember that when we talk about this movement, it's not been equal across all parts of this country. And to be LGBTQ in Mississippi or in the South where values may be different than they are in other parts of the country is different than being out in a state that has a robust progressive set of policies that support the community and provide protections for them.
The next kind of, it's a little bit of a secondary question to the one that we just talked about, but more specifically, what resources can we look at for educating ourselves, for donation, for support, and educating our schools?
Well, I think that the first is really getting clear on what are the lived experiences of LGBTQ students in schools and what are the trends in the data. And so I would encourage people to look at the GLSEN 2017 National School Climate Survey that asks some really key questions around the experience of LGBTQ youth in schools. What we do know is that there are higher rates of suicide, disproportionately impacting the LGBTQ community, higher rates of mental health challenges, higher rates of substance abuse throughout their lives. And so we have to understand that there are profound impacts on systems of oppression or around the attitudes of adults that may not fully embrace students for who they are, whether implicit or explicit. We know when we feel embraced and accepted. So whether somebody's hurling a slur or is just treating you differently, one is obviously more explicit than the other, but they both hurt. And so really understanding the lived experiences of LGBTQ youth, the impact that that has on their well-being in school and therefore their academic performance, and then lifelong indicators of health and economic well-being. I think it's important to understand the interrelationship of those experiences that start in school and carry with LGBTQ people throughout their entire lives.
Yeah, and tying into a possible future topic, I know that there's also the Trevor Project, which is suicide prevention for LGBTQ plus youth. And also it's important to reach out to your local resources as well.
Yeah, and I think the Human Rights Campaign Foundation also has the Welcoming Schools Initiative, which is doing work in public schools across the country to provide a more safe and welcome climate for LGBTQ youth. So I'd encourage people to check out welcomingschools.org as well.
All right. So before we close, we thought if we had some time that we would go over the modern American history of the gay rights movement. But like you said, it does have a longer history and a history outside of America. But this is sort of the modern, like what we kind of think of right now. So in 1924, the first gay rights organization is founded, the Society for Human Rights. In 1950, Madison Foundation begins, which is a gay rights group. And then in 1953, President Eisenhower signs the executive order banning gay people from federal jobs, unfortunately. In 1961, Illinois becomes the first state to decriminalize homosexuality. In 1966, we have sit-ins, which is borrowed from the civil rights sit-ins. So LGBTQ community members would sit in at local bars that normally would have rejected customers for their sexuality. In 1969, we have the Stonewall riots. So in New York, police, they raid the Stonewall Inn, which is a gay-friendly club, but patrons fight back, and this results in a full-blown riot. In 1970, we have the first gay pride parade. In 1978, Gilbert Baker reveals the rainbow flag, and then, of course, after that, we see these variations on the flag. Some more new ones include the transgender flag or the bisexual colors. In the 1980s through the 1990s, we see the AIDS outbreak, and then in 1992, DC passes the law to allow same-sex couples to be registered as domestic partners. In 1999, President Clinton declares June Pride Month. In 2004, Massachusetts becomes the first state to legalize same-sex marriages, and that day many couples wed. And then June 2015, gay marriage is legalized by the Supreme Court. So again, like we have been talking about, while there are steps forward, there are also steps back, but it's always important to keep fighting.
Yes, that's right. And even recently, as June of this year, the Supreme Court just ruled on a fundamental issue. Gender identity and sexual orientation are protected under employment. So lots of progress has been made, and we have more progress to make. And it's important that we center the voices of those in our community that are most marginalized by the movement to help define our strategy moving forward.
if you're watching this video, I think you've kind of taken the first step, whether you identify in the community or not, you're interested in learning. And I think the desire to kind of engage yourself in the history of it, and especially what you can do now, as there's a lot of different moves and legislation and things like that. Educating yourself is definitely the most important thing. So I'm sure we can get those resources posted somewhere for you guys to look at. But thank you so much, Alex. We really appreciate your time. You're very busy.
Alex.
Thank you. This was it was good to connect with you, and I hope that all those watching, whether they identify or are questioning whether they identify or are allies, learn something.